Section 7 of Winesburg, Ohio. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Winesburg, Ohio by Sherwood Anderson. Section 7. Godliness, Part 1. There were always 3 or 4 old people sitting on the front porch of the house or puttering about the garden of the Bentley farm. 3 of the old people were women and sisters to Jessie. They were a colorless, soft-voiced lot. Then there was a silent old man with thin white hair who was Jessie's uncle. The farmhouse was built of wood, a board outer covering over a framework of logs. It was in reality not one house, but a cluster of houses joined together in a rather haphazard manner. Inside, the place was full of surprises. One went up steps from the living room into the dining room, and there were always steps to be ascended or descended in passing from one room to another. At meal times the place was like a beehive. At one moment all was quiet. Then doors began to open, feet clattered on stairs, a murmur of soft voices arose, and people appeared from a dozen obscure corners. Beside the old people already mentioned, many others lived in the Bentley house. There were 4 hired men, a woman named Aunt Callie Beebe, who was in charge of the housekeeping, a dull-witted girl named Eliza Stoughton, who made beds and helped with the milking, a boy who worked in the stables, and Jesse Bentley himself, the owner and overlord of it all. By the time the American Civil War had been over for 20 years, that part of northern Ohio, where the Bentley farms lay, had begun to emerge from pioneer life. Jesse then owned machinery for harvesting grain. He had built modern barns, and most of his land was drained with carefully laid tile drain. But in order to understand the man, we will have to go back to an earlier day. The Bentley family had been in northern Ohio for several generations before Jesse's time. They came from New York State and took up land when the country was new and land could be had at a low price. For a long time they, in common with all the other Middle Western people, were very poor. The land they had settled upon was heavily wooded and covered with fallen logs and underbrush. After the long, hard labor of clearing these away and cutting the timber, there were still the stumps to be reckoned with. Plows run through the fields, caught on hidden roots. Stones lay all about. On the low places water gathered, and the young corn turned yellow, sickened, and died. When Jesse Bentley's father and brothers had come into their ownership of the place, much of the harder part of the work of clearing had been done, but they clung to old traditions and worked like driven animals. They lived as practically all of the farming people of the time lived. In the spring and through most of the winter, the highways leading into the town of Winesburg were a sea of mud. The 4 young men of the family worked hard all day in the fields. They ate heavily of coarse, greasy food, and at night slept like tired beasts on beds of straw. Into their lives came little that was not coarse and brutal, and outwardly they were themselves coarse and brutal. On Saturday afternoons they hitched a team of horses to a 3-seated wagon and went off to town. In town they stood about the stoves in the stores, talking to other farmers or to the storekeepers. They were dressed in overalls, and in the winter wore heavy coats that were flecked with mud. Their hands, as they stretched them out to the heat of the stoves, were cracked and red. It was difficult for them to talk, and so they, for the most part, kept silent. When they had bought meat, flour, sugar, and salt, they went into one of the Winesburg saloons and drank beer. Under the influence of drink, the naturally strong lusts of their natures, kept suppressed by the heroic labor of breaking up new ground, were released. A kind of crude and animal-like poetic fervor took possession of them. On the road home they stood up on the wagon seats and shouted at the stars. Sometimes they fought long and bitterly, and at other times they broke forth into songs. Once Enoch Bentley, the older one of the boys, struck his father, old Tom Bentley, with the butt of a teamster's whip, and the old man seemed likely to die. For days Enoch lay hid in the straw in the loft of the stable, ready to flee if the result of his momentary passion turned out to be murder. He was kept alive with food brought by his mother, who also kept him informed of the injured man's condition. When all turned out well, he emerged from his hiding place and went back to the work of clearing land, as though nothing had happened. The Civil War brought a sharp turn to the fortunes of the Bentleys, and was responsible for the rise of the youngest son, Jesse. Enoch, Edward, Harry, and Will Bentley all enlisted, and before the long war ended, they were all killed. For a time after, they went away to the South. Old Tom tried to run the place, but he was not successful. When the last of the four had been killed, he sent word to Jesse that he would have to come home. Then the mother, who had not been well for a year, died suddenly, and the father became altogether discouraged. He talked of selling the farm and moving into town. All day he went about shaking his head and muttering. The work in the fields was neglected, and weeds grew high in the corn. Old Tom hired men, but he did not use them intelligently. When they had gone away to the fields in the morning, he wandered into the woods and sat down on a log. Sometimes he forgot to come home at night, and one of the daughters had to go in search of him. When Jesse Bentley came home to the farm and began to take charge of things, he was a slight, sensitive-looking man of 22. At 18 he had left home to go to school to become a scholar, and eventually to become a minister of the Presbyterian Church. All through his boyhood he had been what in our country was called an odd sheep, and had not got on with his brothers. Of all the family, only his mother had understood him, and she was now dead. When he came home to take charge of the farm, that had at that time grown to more than 600 acres, everyone on the farms about and in the nearby town of Winesburg smiled at the idea of his trying to handle the work that had been done by his 4 strong brothers. There was indeed good cause to smile. By the standards of his day, Jesse did not look like a man at all. He was small and very slender, and womanish of body, and true to the traditions of young ministers, wore a long black coat and a narrow black string tie. The neighbors were amused when they saw him, after the years away, and they were even more amused when they saw the woman he had married in the city. As a matter of fact, Jesse's wife did soon go under. That was perhaps Jesse's fault. A farm in northern Ohio in the hard years after the Civil War was no place for a delicate woman, and Catherine Bentley was delicate. Jesse was hard with her, as he was with everybody about him in those days. She tried to do such work as all the neighbor women about her did, and he let her go on without interference. She helped to do the milking and did part of the housework. She made the beds for the men and prepared their food. For a year she worked every day from sunrise until late at night, and then after giving birth to a child she died. As for Jesse Bentley, although he was a delicately built man, there was something within him that could not easily be killed. He had brown curly hair and gray eyes that were at times hard and direct, at times wavering and uncertain. Not only was he slender, but he was also short of stature. His mouth was like the mouth of a sensitive and very determined child. Jesse Bentley was a fanatic. He was a man born out of his time and place, and for this he suffered and made others suffer. Never did he succeed in getting what he wanted out of life, and he did not know what he wanted. Within a very short time after he came home to the Bentley farm, he made everyone there a little afraid of him, and his wife, who should have been close to him, as his mother had been, was afraid also. At the end of 2 weeks after his coming, old Tom Bentley made over to him the entire ownership of the place and retired into the background. Everyone retired into the background. In spite of his youth and inexperience, Jesse had the trick of mastering the souls of his people. He was so earnest in everything he did and said that no one understood him. He made everyone on the farm work as they had never worked before, and yet there was no joy in the work. If things went well, they went well for Jesse and never for the people who were his dependents. Like 1,000 other strong men who have come into the world here in America in these later times, Jesse was but half strong. He could master others, but he could not master himself. The running of the farm, as it had never been run before, was easy for him. When he came home from Cleveland, where he had been in school, he shut himself off from all of his people and began to make plans. He thought about the farm night and day, and that made him successful. Other men on the farms about him worked too hard and were too tired to think. But to think of the farm and to be everlastingly making plans for its success was a relief to Jesse. It partially satisfied something in his passionate nature. Immediately after he came home, he had a wing built onto the old house, and in a large room facing the west, he had windows that looked into the barnyard and other windows that looked off across the fields. By the window he sat down to think. Hour after hour and day after day, he sat and looked over the land and thought out his new place in life. The passionate burning thing in his nature flamed up and his eyes became hard. He wanted to make the farm produce as no farm in his state had ever produced before, and then he wanted something else. It was the indefinable hunger within that made his eyes waver, and that kept him always more and more silent before people. He would have given much to achieve peace, and in him was a fear that peace was the thing he could not achieve. All over his body Jesse Bentley was alive. In his small frame was gathered the force of a long line of strong men. He'd always been extraordinarily alive when he was a small boy on the farm, and later when he was a young man in school. In the school he had studied and thought of God and the Bible with his whole mind and heart. As time passed and he grew to know people better, he began to think of himself as an extraordinary man, one set apart from his fellows. He wanted terribly to make his life a thing of great importance, and as he looked about at his fellow men and saw how like clods they lived, it seemed to him that he could not bear to become also such a clod. Although in his absorption in himself and in his own destiny he was blind to the fact that his young wife was doing a strong woman's work, even after she had become large with child, and that she was killing herself in his service, he did not intend to be unkind to her. When his father, who was old and twisted with toil, made over to him the ownership of the farm, and seemed content to creep away to a corner and wait for death, he shrugged his shoulders and dismissed the old man from his mind. In the room by the window overlooking the land that had come down to him, sat Jesse thinking of his own affairs. In the stables he could hear the tramping of his horses and the restless movement of his cattle. Away in the fields he could see other cattle wandering over green hills. The voices of men, his men who worked for him, came in to him through the window. From the milk house there was the steady thump-thump of a churn being manipulated by the half-witted girl Eliza Stoughton. Jesse's mind went back to the men of Old Testament days, who had also owned lands and herds. He remembered how God had come down out of the skies and talked to these men, and he wanted God to notice and to talk to him also. A kind of feverish, boyish eagerness to in some way achieve in his own life the flavor of significance that had hung over these men took possession of him. Being a prayerful man, he spoke of the matter aloud to God, and the sound of his own words strengthened and fed his eagerness. "I am a new kind of man, come into possession of these fields," he declared. "Look upon me, O God, and look thou also upon my neighbors, and all the men who have gone before me here. O God, create in me another Jesse, like that one of old, to rule over men, and to be the father of sons who shall be rulers." Jesse grew excited as he talked aloud, and jumping to his feet, walked up and down in the room. In fancy he saw himself living in old times and among old peoples. The land that lay stretched out before him became of vast significance, a place peopled by his fancy, with a new race of men sprung from himself. It seemed to him that in his day, as in those other and older days, kingdoms might be created and new impulses given to the lives of men by the power of God speaking through a chosen servant. He longed to be such a servant. "It is God's work I have come to the land to do," he declared in a loud voice, and his short figure straightened, and he thought that something like a halo of godly approval hung over him. It will perhaps be somewhat difficult for the men and women of a later day to understand Jesse Bentley. In the last 50 years a vast change has taken place in the lives of our people. A revolution has in fact taken place. The coming of industrialism, attended by all the roar and rattle of affairs, the shrill cries of millions of new voices that have come among us from overseas, the going and coming of trains, the growth of cities, the building of the interurban car lines that weave in and out of towns and past farmhouses, and now in these later days, the coming of the automobiles has worked a tremendous change in the lives and in the habits of thought of our people of mid-America. Books, badly imagined and written though they may be in the hurry of our times, are in every household. Magazines circulate by the millions of copies. Newspapers are everywhere. In our day, a farmer standing by the stove in the store in his village has his mind filled to overflowing with the words of other men. The newspapers and the magazines have pumped him full. Much of the old brutal ignorance that had in it also a kind of beautiful childlike innocence is gone forever. The farmer by the stove is brother to the men of the cities, and if you listen you will find him talking as glibly and as senselessly as the best city man of us all. In Jesse Bentley's time and in the country districts of the whole Middle West, in the years after the Civil War, it was not so. Men labored too hard and were too tired to read. In them was no desire for words printed upon paper. As they worked in the fields, vague, half-formed thoughts took possession of them. They believed in God and in God's power to control their lives. In the little Protestant churches they gathered on Sunday to hear of God and His works. The churches were the center of the social and intellectual life of the times. The figure of God was big in the hearts of men. And so, having been born an imaginative child, and having within him a great intellectual eagerness, Jesse Bentley had turned wholeheartedly toward God. When the war took his brothers away, he saw the hand of God in that. When his father became ill and could no longer attend to the running of the farm, he took that also as a sign from God. In the city, when the word came to him, he walked about at night through the streets, thinking of the matter, and when he had come home and had got the work on the farm well under way, he went again at night to walk through the forests and over the low hills, and to think of God. As he walked, the importance of his own figure in some divine plan grew in his mind. He grew avaricious and was impatient that the farm contained only 600 acres. Kneeling in a fence corner at the edge of some meadow, he sent his voice abroad into the silence, and looking up he saw the stars shining down at him. One evening, some months after his father's death, and when his wife Catherine was expecting at any moment to be laid abed of childbirth, Jesse left his house and went for a long walk. The Bentley farm was situated in a tiny valley watered by Wine Creek, and Jesse walked along the banks of the stream to the end of his own land and on through the fields of his neighbors. As he walked, the valley broadened and then narrowed again. Great open stretches of field and wood lay before him. The moon came out from behind clouds, and climbing a low hill he sat down to think. Jesse thought that as the true servant of God, the entire stretch of country through which he had walked should have come into his possession. He thought of his dead brothers and blamed them that they had not worked harder and achieved more. Before him in the moonlight the tiny stream ran down over stones, and he began to think of the men of old times who, like himself, had owned flocks and lands. A fantastic impulse, half fear, half greediness, took possession of Jesse Bentley. He remembered how in the old Bible story the Lord had appeared to that other Jesse and told him to send his son David to where Saul and the men of Israel were fighting the Philistines in the valley of Elah. Into Jesse's mind came the conviction that all of the Ohio farmers who owned land in the valley of Wine Creek were Philistines and enemies of God. Suppose, he whispered to himself, there should come from among them one who, like Goliath the Philistine of Gath, could defeat me and take from me my possessions. In fancy he felt the sickening dread that he thought must have lain heavy on the heart of Saul before the coming of David. Jumping to his feet, he began to run through the night. As he ran, he called to God. His voice carried far over the low hills. Jehovah of hosts, he cried, send to me this night out of the womb of Catherine a son. Let thy grace alight upon me. Send me a son to be called David, who shall help me to pluck at last all of these lands out of the hands of the Philistines, and turn them to thy service and to the building of thy kingdom on earth. End of section 7.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. To learn more or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading today by Webb Webster, www.webslog.com. Franklin, Tennessee, June 2007. Winesburg, Ohio by Sherwood Anderson, Section 8, Godliness, Part 2, also concerning Jesse Bentley. David Hardy of Winesburg, Ohio, was the grandson of Jesse Bentley, the owner of Bentley Farms. When he was 12 years old, he went to the old Bentley place to live. His mother, Louise Bentley, the girl who came into the world on that night when Jesse ran through the fields crying to God that he be given a son, had grown to womanhood on the farm and had married young John Hardy of Winesburg, who became a banker. Louise and her husband did not live happily together, and everyone agreed that she was to blame. She was a small woman with sharp gray eyes and black hair. From childhood she had been inclined to fits of temper, and when not angry she was often morose and silent. In Winesburg it was said that she drank. Her husband, the banker, who was a careful, shrewd man, tried hard to make her happy. When he began to make money, he bought for her a large brick house on Elm Street in Winesburg, and he was the first man in that town to keep a manservant to drive his wife's carriage. But Louise could not be made happy. She flew into half-insane fits of temper during which she was sometimes silent, sometimes noisy and quarrelsome. She swore and cried out in her anger. She got a knife from the kitchen and threatened her husband's life. Once she deliberately set fire to the house, and often she hid herself away for days in her own room and would see no one. Her life, lived as a half-recluse, gave rise to all sorts of stories concerning her. It was said that she took drugs, and that she often hid herself away from people because she was so under the influence of drink that her condition could not be concealed. Sometimes, on summer afternoons, she came out of the house and got into her carriage. Dismissing the driver, she took the reins in her own hands and drove off at top speed through the streets. If a pedestrian got in the way, she drove straight ahead, and the frightened citizen had to escape as best he could. To the people of the town, it seemed as though she wanted to run them down. When she had driven through several streets, tearing around corners and beating the horses with the whip, she drove off into the country. On the country roads, after she had gotten out of the sight of the houses, she let her horses slow to a walk, and her wild, reckless mood passed. She became thoughtful and muttered words. Sometimes tears came to her eyes, and then, when she came back into town again, she drove furiously through the quiet streets. But for the influence of her husband, and the respect he inspired in people's minds, she would have been arrested more than once by the town's marshal. Young David Hardy grew up in the house with this woman, and as can be well imagined, there was not much joy in his childhood. He was too young then to have opinions of his own about people, but at times it was difficult for him not to have very definite opinions about the woman who was his mother. David was always a quiet, orderly boy, and for a long time was thought by the people of Winesburg to be something of a dullard. His eyes were brown, and as a child he had a habit of looking at things and people a long time without appearing to see what he was looking at. When he heard his mother spoken of harshly, or when he overheard her berating his father, he was frightened and ran away to hide. Sometimes he could not find a hiding place, and that confused him. Turning his face toward a tree, or if he was indoors, toward a wall, he closed his eyes and tried not to think of anything. He had a habit of talking aloud to himself, and early in life a spirit of quiet sadness often took possession of him. On the occasions when David went to visit his grandfather on the Bentley farm, he was altogether contented and happy. Often he wished that he could never have to go back to town, and once, when he had come home from the farm after a long visit, something happened that had had a lasting effect on his mind. David had come back into town with one of the hired men. The man was in a hurry to go about his own affairs and left the boy at the head of the street in which the Hardy house stood. It was early dusk of a fall evening, and the sky was overcast with clouds. Something happened to David. He could not bear to go into the house where his mother and father lived, and on an impulse he decided to run away from home. He intended to go back to the farm and to his grandfather, but lost his way, and for hours he wandered weeping and frightened on country roads. It started to rain, and lightning flashed in the sky. The boy's imagination was excited, and he fancied that he could see and hear strange things in the darkness. Into his mind came the conviction that he was walking and running in some terrible void where no one had ever been before. The darkness about him seemed limitless. The sound of the wind blowing in trees was terrifying. When a team of horses approached along the road in which he walked, he was frightened and climbed a fence. Through a field he ran until he came into another road, and getting upon his knees felt of the soft ground with his fingers. But for the figure of his grandfather, whom he was afraid he would never find in the darkness, he thought the world must be altogether empty. When his cries were heard by a farmer who was walking home from town, and he was brought back to his father's house, he was so tired and excited that he did not know what was happening to him. By chance, David's father knew that he had disappeared. On the street he had met the farmhand from the Bentley place, and knew of his son's return to town. When the boy did not come home, an alarm was set up, and John Hardy, with several men of the town, went to search the country. The report that David had been kidnapped ran about through the streets of Winesburg. When he came home, there were no lights in the house, but his mother appeared and clutched him eagerly in her arms. David thought she had suddenly become another woman. He could not believe that so delightful a thing had happened. With her own hands, Louise Hardy bathed his tired young body and cooked him food. She would not let him go to bed, but when he had put on his nightgown, blew out the lights and sat down in a chair to hold him in her arms. For an hour the woman sat in the darkness and held her boy. All the time she kept talking in a low voice. David could not understand what had so changed her. Her habitually dissatisfied face had become, he thought, the most peaceful and lovely thing he had ever seen. When she began to weep, she held him more and more tightly. On and on went her voice. It was not harsh or shrill as when she talked to her husband, but was like rain falling on trees. Presently, men began coming to the door to report that he had not been found, but she made him hide and be silent until she had sent them away. He thought it must be a game his mother and the men of the town were playing with him, and he laughed joyously. Into his mind came the thought that his having been lost and frightened in a darkness was an altogether unimportant matter. He thought he would have been willing to go through the frightful experience 1,000 times to be sure of finding at the end of the long black road a thing so lovely as his mother had suddenly become. During the last years of young David's boyhood he saw his mother but seldom, and she became for him just a woman with whom he had once lived. Still, he could not get her figure out of his mind, and as he grew older it became more definite. When he was 12 years old, he went to the Bentley farm to live. Old Jesse came into town and fairly demanded that he be given charge of the boy. The old man was excited and determined on having his own way. He talked to John Hardy in the office of the Winesburg Savings Bank, and then the two men went to the house on Elm Street to talk to Louise. They both expected her to make trouble, but were mistaken. She was very quiet, and when Jesse had explained his mission and had gone on at some length about the advantages to come through having the boy out of doors and in the quiet atmosphere of the old farmhouse, she nodded her head in approval. "It is an atmosphere not corrupted by my presence," she said sharply. Her shoulders shook, and she seemed about to fly into a fit of temper. "It is a place for a man-child, although it was never a place for me," she went on. "You never wanted me there, and of course the air of your house did me no good. It was like poison in my blood, but it will be different with him." Louise turned and went out of the room, leaving the two men to sit in embarrassed silence. As very often happened, she later stayed in her room for days. Even when the boy's clothes were packed and he was taken away, she did not appear. The loss of her son made a sharp break in her life, and she seemed less inclined to quarrel with her husband. John Hardy thought it had all turned out very well indeed. And so young David went to live in the Bentley farmhouse with Jessie. Two of the old farmer's sisters were alive and still lived in the house. They were afraid of Jessie and rarely spoke when he was about. One of the women, who had been noted for her flaming red hair when she was younger, was a born mother and became the boy's caretaker. Every night when he had gone to bed, she went into his room and sat on the floor until he fell asleep. When he became drowsy, she became bold and whispered things that he later thought he must have dreamed. Her soft, low voice called him endearing names, and he dreamed that his mother had come to him and that she had changed so that she was always as she had been that time after he ran away. He also grew bold, and reaching out his hand stroked the face of the woman on the floor so that she was ecstatically happy. Everyone in the old house became happy after the boy went there. The hard, insistent thing in Jesse Bentley that had kept the people in the house silent and timid, and that had never been dispelled by the presence of the girl Louise, was apparently swept away by the coming of the boy. It was as though God had relented and sent a son to the man. The man who had proclaimed himself the only true servant of God in all the valley of Wine Creek, and who had wanted God to send him a sign of approval by way of a son out of the womb of Catherine, began to think that at last his prayers had been answered. Although he was at that time only 55 years old, he looked 70 and was worn out with much thinking and scheming. The effort he had made to extend his land holdings had been successful, and there were few farms in the valley that did not belong to him. But until David came, he was a bitterly disappointed man. There were two influences at work in Jesse Bentley, and all his life his mind had been a battleground for these influences. First, there was the old thing in him. He wanted to be a man of God and a leader among men of God. His walking in the fields and through the forests at night had brought him close to nature, and there were forces in the passionately religious man that ran out to the forces in nature. The disappointment that had come to him when a daughter and not a son had been born to Catherine had fallen on him like a blow struck by some unseen hand, and the blow had somewhat softened his egotism. He still believed God might at any moment make himself manifest out of the winds or the clouds, but he no longer demanded such recognition. Instead, he prayed for it. Sometimes he was altogether doubtful and thought God had deserted the world. He regretted the fate that had not let him live in a simpler and sweeter time when, at the beckoning of some strange cloud in the sky, men left their lands and houses and went forth into the wilderness to create new races. While he worked night and day to make his farms more productive and to extend his holdings of land, he regretted that he could not use his own restless energy in the building of temples, the slaying of unbelievers, and in general, in the work of glorifying God's name on earth. This is what Jesse hungered for, and then also he hungered for something else. He had grown into maturity in America in the years after the Civil War, and he, like all men of his time, had been touched by the deep influences that were at work in the country during those years when modern industrialism was being born. He began by buying machines that would permit him to do the work of the farms while employing fewer men, and he sometimes thought that if he were a younger man he would have given up farming altogether and started a factory in Winesburg for the making of machinery. Jesse formed the habit of reading newspapers and magazines. He invented a machine for the making a fence out of wire. Faintly, he realized that the atmosphere of old times and places that he had always cultivated in his own mind was strange and foreign to the thing that was growing up in the minds of others. The beginning of the most materialistic age in the history of the world, when wars would be fought without patriotism, when men would forget God and only pay attention to moral standards, when the will to power would replace the will to serve, and beauty would be well nigh forgotten in the terrible headlong rush of mankind toward the acquiring of possessions, was telling its story to Jesse, the man of God, as it was to the men about him. The greedy thing in him wanted to make money faster than it could be made by tilling the land. More than once he went into Winesburg to talk with his son-in-law John Hardy about it. "You are a banker, and you'll have choices I never had," he said, and his eyes shone. "I'm thinking about it all the time. Big things are going to be done in the country, and there will be more money to be made than I ever dreamed of. You get into it. I wish I were younger and had your chance." Jesse Bentley walked up and down the bank office and grew more and more excited as he talked. At one time in his life he had been threatened with paralysis, and his left side remained somewhat weakened. As he talked, his left eyelid twitched. Later, when he drove back home and when night was come on and the stars came out, it was harder to get back the old feeling of a close and personal God who lived in the sky overhead and who might, at any moment, reach out his hand, touch him on the shoulder, and appoint him some heroic task to be done. Jesse's mind was fixed upon the things read in newspapers and magazines, on fortunes to be made almost without effort by shrewd men who bought and sold. For him, the coming of the boy David did much to bring back with renewed force the old faith, and it seemed to him that God had at last looked with favor upon him. As for the boy on the farm, life began to reveal itself to him in 1,000 new and delightful ways. The kindly attitude of all about him expanded his quiet nature, and he lost the half-timid, hesitating manner he had always had with his people. At night, when he went to bed after a long day of adventures in the stables, in the fields, or driving about from farm to farm with his grandfather, he wanted to embrace everyone in the house. If Shirley Bentley, the woman who came each night to sit on the floor by his bedside, did not appear at once, he went to the head of the stairs and shouted, his young voice ringing through the narrow halls where for so long there had been a tradition of silence. In the morning, when he awoke and lay still in bed, the sounds that came to him through the windows filled him with delight. He thought with a shudder of the life in the house in Winesburg, and of his mother's angry voice that had always made him tremble. There in the country all sounds were pleasant sounds. When he awoke at dawn, the barnyard back of the house also awoke. In the house people stirred about. Eliza Stoughton, the half-witted girl, was poked in the ribs by a farmhand and giggled noisily. In some distant field a cow bawled and was answered by the cattle in the stables, and one of the farmhands spoke sharply to the horse he was grooming by the stable door. David leaped out of bed and ran to the window. All of the people stirring about excited his mind, and he wondered what his mother was doing in the house in town. From the windows of his own room, he could not see directly into the barnyard where the farmhands had now all assembled to do the morning chores, but he could hear the voices of the men and the neighing of the horses. When one of the men laughed, he laughed also. Leaning out of the open window, he looked into an orchard where a fat sow wandered about with a litter of tiny pigs at her heels. Every morning he counted the pigs. 4, 5, 6, 7, he said slowly, wetting his finger and making straight up and down marks on the window ledge. David ran to put on his trousers and shirt. A feverish desire to get out of doors took possession of him. Every morning he made such a noise coming downstairs that Aunt Callie, the housekeeper, declared that he was trying to tear the house down. When he had run through the long old house, shutting the doors behind him with a bang, he came into the barnyard and looked about with an amazed air of expectancy. It seemed to him that in such a place tremendous things might have happened during the night. The farmhands looked at him and laughed. Harry Strader, an old man who had been on the farm since Jesse came into possession, and who, before David's time, had never been known to make a joke, made the same joke every morning. It amused David so that he laughed and clapped his hands. "See, come here and look," cried the old man. "Grandfather Jesse's white mare has torn the black stocking she wears on her foot." Day after day through the long summer, Jesse Bentley drove from farm to farm and down the valley of Wine Creek, and his grandson went with him. They rode in a comfortable old phaeton drawn by the white horse. The old man scratched his thin white beard and talked to himself of his plans for increasing the productiveness of the fields they visited, and of God's part in the plans all men made. Sometimes he looked at David and smiled happily, and then for a long time he appeared to forget the boy's existence. More and more every day now his mind turned back to the dreams that had filled his mind when he had first come out of the city to live on the land. One afternoon he startled David by letting his dreams take possession of him. With the boy as a witness, he went through a ceremony and brought about an accident that nearly destroyed the companionship that was growing up between them. Jesse and his grandson were driving in a distant part of the valley some miles from home. A forest came down to the road, and through the forest Wine Creek wriggled its way over stones toward a distant river. All the afternoon Jesse had been in a meditative mood, and now he began to talk. His mind went back to the night when he had been frightened by thoughts of a giant that might come to rob and plunder him of his possessions, and again, as on that night when he had run through the fields crying for a son, he became excited to the edge of insanity. Stopping the horse, he got out of the buggy and asked David to get out also. The two climbed over a fence and walked along the bank of a stream. The boy paid no attention to the muttering of his grandfather, but ran along beside him and wondered what was going to happen. When a rabbit jumped up and ran away through the woods, he clapped his hands and danced with delight. He looked at the tall trees and was sorry that he was not a little animal to climb high in the air without being frightened. Stooping, he picked up a small stone and threw it over the head of his grandfather into a clump of bushes. "Wake up, little animal! Go, climb to the top of the trees," he shouted in a shrill voice. Jesse Bentley went along under the trees with his head bowed and with his mind in a ferment. His earnestness affected the boy, who presently became silent and a little alarmed. Into the old man's mind had come the notion that he could bring from God a word or a sign out of the sky, that the presence of the boy and the man on their knees in some lonely spot in the forest would make the miracle he had been waiting for almost inevitable. It was in just such a place as this that other David tended the sheep when his father came and told him to go down unto Saul, he muttered. Taking the boy roughly by the shoulder, he climbed over a fallen log, and when he had come to an open place among the trees, he dropped upon his knees and began to pray in a loud voice. A kind of terror he had never known before took possession of David. Crouching beneath a tree, he watched the old man on the ground before him, and his own knees began to tremble. It seemed to him that he was in the presence not only of his grandfather, but of someone else, someone who might hurt him, someone who was not kindly but dangerous and brutal. He began to cry, and reaching down, picked up a small stick which he held tightly gripped between his fingers. When Jesse Bentley, absorbed in his own idea, suddenly arose and advanced toward him. His terror grew until his whole body shook. In the woods an intense silence seemed to lie over everything, and suddenly out of the silence came the old man's harsh and insistent voice. Gripping the boy's shoulders, Jesse turned his face to the sky and shouted. The whole left side of his face twitched, and his hand on the boy's shoulder twitched also. "Make a sign to me, God," he cried. "Here I stand with the boy, David. Come down to me out of the sky and make thy presence known to me." With a cry of fear, David turned, and shaking himself loose from the hands that held him, ran away from the forest. He did not believe that the old man who turned up his face and in a harsh voice shouted at the sky was his grandfather at all. The man did not look like his grandfather. The conviction that something strange and terrible had happened, that by some miracle a new and dangerous person had come into the body of a kindly old man, took possession of him. On he ran down the hillside, sobbing as he ran. When he fell over the roots of a tree and in falling struck his head, he arose and tried to run again. His head was hurt so that he presently fell down and lay still, but it was only after Jesse had carried him to the buggy and he awoke to find the old man's hand stroking his head tenderly that the terror left him. "Take me away. There's a terrible man back there in the woods," he declared firmly, while Jesse looked over the tops of the trees, and again his lips cried out, "God, what have I done that thou dost not approve of me?" he whispered softly, saying the words over and over as he drove rapidly along the road with the boy's cut and bleeding head held tenderly against his shoulder. End of section 8.
Section 9 of Winesburg, Ohio. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Stuart Wills. Winesburg, Ohio, by Sherwood Anderson. Section 9. Godliness. Part 3. Surrender. The story of Louise Bentley, who became Mrs. John Hardy and lived with her husband in a brick house on Elm Street in Winesburg, is a story of misunderstanding. Before such women as Louise can be understood and their lives made livable, much will have to be done. Thoughtful books will have to be written, and thoughtful lives lived by people about them. Born of a delicate and overworked mother and an impulsive, hard, imaginative father who did not look with favor upon her coming into the world, Louise was from childhood a neurotic, one of the race of oversensitive women that in later days industrialism was to bring in such great numbers into the world. During her early years she lived on the Bentley farm, a silent, moody child, wanting love more than anything else in the world, and not getting it. When she was 15 she went to live in Winesburg with the family of Albert Hardy, who had a store for the sale of buggies and wagons, and who was a member of the town board of education. Louise went into town to be a student in the Winesburg High School, and she went to live at the Hardys because Albert Hardy and her father were friends. Hardy, the vehicle merchant of Winesburg, like thousands of other men of his times, was an enthusiast on the subject of education. He had made his own way in the world without learning got from books, but he was convinced that had he but known books, things would have gone better with him. To everyone who came into his shop he talked of the matter, and in his own household he drove his family distracted by his constant harping on the subject. He had 2 daughters and 1 son, John Hardy, and more than once the daughters threatened to leave school altogether. As a matter of principle they did just enough work in their classes to avoid punishment. "I hate books and I hate anyone who likes books," Harriet, the younger of the 2 girls, declared passionately. In Winesburg, as on the farm, Louise was not happy. For years she had dreamed of the time when she could go forth into the world, and she looked upon the move into the Hardy household as a great step in the direction of freedom. Always when she had thought of the matter it had seemed to her that in town all must be gaiety and life, that there men and women must live happily and freely, giving and taking friendship and affection, as one takes the feel of a wind on the cheek. After the silence and the cheerlessness of life in the Bentley house, she dreamed of stepping forth into an atmosphere that was warm and pulsating with life and reality. And in the Hardy household Louise might have got something of the thing for which she so hungered, but for a mistake she made when she had just come to town. Louise won the disfavor of the two Hardy girls, Mary and Harriet, by her application to her studies in school. She did not come to the house until the day when school was to begin, and knew nothing of the feeling they had in the matter. She was timid, and during the first month made no acquaintances. Every Friday afternoon one of the hired men from the farm drove into Winesburg and took her home for the weekend, so that she did not spend the Saturday holiday with the townspeople. Because she was embarrassed and lonely, she worked constantly at her studies. To Mary and Harriet it seemed as though she tried to make trouble for them by her proficiency. In her eagerness to appear well, Louise wanted to answer every question put to the class by the teacher. She jumped up and down and her eyes flashed. Then, when she had answered some question the others in the class had been unable to answer, she smiled happily. "See, I have done it for you," her eyes seemed to say. "You need not bother about the matter. I will answer all the questions. For the whole class it will be easy while I am here." In the evening after supper in the Hardy house, Albert Hardy began to praise Louise. One of the teachers had spoken highly of her, and he was delighted. "Well, again I have heard it," he began, looking hard at his daughters, and then turning to smile at Louise. "Another of the teachers has told me of the good work Louise is doing. Everyone in Winesburg is telling me how smart she is. I am ashamed that they do not speak so of my own girls." Arising, the merchant marched about the room and lighted his evening cigar. The two girls looked at each other and shook their heads wearily. Seeing their indifference, the father became angry. "I tell you it is something for you two to be thinking about," he cried, glaring at them. "There is a big change coming here in America, and in learning is the only hope of the coming generations. Louise is the daughter of a rich man, but she is not ashamed to study. It should make you ashamed to see what she does." The merchant took his hat from a rack by the door and prepared to depart for the evening. At the door he stopped and glared back. So fierce was his manner that Louise was frightened and ran upstairs to her own room. The daughters began to speak of their own affairs. "Pay attention to me," roared the merchant. "Your minds are lazy. Your indifference to education is affecting your characters. You will amount to nothing. Now mark what I say. Louise will be so far ahead of you that you will never catch up." The distracted man went out of the house and into the street, shaking with wrath. He went along muttering words and swearing, but when he got into Main Street his anger passed. He stopped to talk of the weather or the crops with some other merchant or with a farmer who had come into town, and forgot his daughters altogether, or if he thought of them, only shrugged his shoulders. "Oh well, girls will be girls," he muttered philosophically. In the house, when Louise came down into the room where the two girls sat, they would have nothing to do with her. One evening, after she had been there for more than 6 weeks, and was heartbroken because of the continued air of coldness with which she was always greeted, she burst into tears. "Shut up your crying and go back to your own room and to your books," Mary Hardy said sharply. The room occupied by Louise was on the second floor of the Hardy house, and her window looked out upon an orchard. There was a stove in the room, and every evening young John Hardy carried up an armful of wood and put it in a box that stood by the wall. During the second month after she came to the house, Louise gave up all hope of getting on a friendly footing with the Hardy girls, and went to her own room as soon as the evening meal was at an end. Her mind began to play with thoughts of making friends with John Hardy. When he came into the room with the wood in his arms, she pretended to be busy with her studies, but watched him eagerly. When he had put the wood in the box and turned to go out, she put down her head and blushed. She tried to make talk, but could say nothing, and after he had gone she was angry at herself for her stupidity. the mind of the country girl became filled with the idea of drawing close to the young man. She thought that in him might be found the quality she had all her life been seeking in people. It seemed to her that between herself and all the other people in the world a wall had been built up, and that she was living just on the edge of some warm inner circle of life that must be quite open and understandable to others. She became obsessed with the thought that it wanted but a courageous act on her part to make all of her association with people something quite different, and that it was possible by such an act to pass into a new life as one opens a door and goes into a room. Day and night she thought of the matter, but although the thing she wanted so earnestly was something very warm and close, it had as yet no conscious connection with sex. It had not become that definite, and her mind had only alighted upon the person of John Hardy because he was at hand, and unlike his sisters, had not been unfriendly to her. The Hardy sisters, Mary and Harriet, were both older than Louise. In a certain kind of knowledge of the world they were years older. They lived as all of the young women of Midwestern towns lived. In those days young women did not go out of our towns to Eastern colleges, and ideas in regard to social classes had hardly begun to exist. A daughter of a laborer was in much the same social position as the daughter of a farmer or a merchant, and there were no leisure classes. A girl was nice or she was not nice. If a nice girl, she had a young man who came to her house to see her on Sunday and on Wednesday evenings. Sometimes she went with her young man to a dance or a church social. At other times she received him at the house and was given the use of the parlor for that purpose. No one intruded upon her. For hours the two sat behind closed doors. Sometimes the lights were turned low and the young man and woman embraced. Cheeks became hot and hair disarranged. After a year or two, if the impulse within them became strong and insistent enough, they married. One evening during her first winter in Winesburg, Louise had an adventure that gave a new impulse to her desire to break down the wall that she thought stood between her and John Hardy. It was Wednesday, and immediately after the evening meal, Albert Hardy put on his hat and went away. Young John brought the wood and put it in the box in Louise's room. "You do work hard, don't you?" he said awkwardly. And then, before she could answer, he also went away. Louise heard him go out of the house and had a mad desire to run after him. Opening her window, she leaned out and called softly, "John, dear John, come back. Don't go away." The night was cloudy, and she could not see far into the darkness, but as she waited she fancied she could hear a soft little noise as of someone going on tiptoes through the trees in the orchard. She was frightened and closed the window quickly. For an hour she moved about the room trembling with excitement, and when she could not longer bear the waiting, she crept into the hall and down the stairs into a closet-like room that opened off the parlor. Louise had decided that she would perform the courageous act that had for weeks been in her mind. She was convinced that John Hardy had concealed himself in the orchard beneath her window, and she was determined to find him and tell him that she wanted him to come close to her, to hold her in his arms, to tell her of his thoughts and dreams, and to listen while she told him her thoughts and dreams. "In the darkness it will be easier to say things," she whispered to herself, as she stood in the little room groping for the door. And then suddenly Louise realized that she was not alone in the house. In the parlor on the other side of the door a man's voice spoke softly, and the door opened. Louise just had time to conceal herself in a little opening beneath the stairway when Mary Hardy, accompanied by her young man, came into the little dark room. For an hour Louise sat on the floor in the darkness and listened. Without words, Mary Hardy, with the aid of the man who had come to spend the evening with her, brought to the country girl a knowledge of men and women. Putting her head down until she was curled into a little ball, she lay perfectly still. It seemed to her that by some strange impulse of the gods, a great gift had been brought to Mary Hardy, and she could not understand the older woman's determined protest. The young man took Mary Hardy into his arms and kissed her. When she struggled and laughed, he but held her more tightly. For an hour the contest between them went on, and then they went back into the parlor, and Louise escaped up the stairs. "I hope you were quiet out there. You must not disturb the little mouse at her studies," she heard Harriet saying to her sister, as she stood by her own door in the hallway above. Louise wrote a note to John Hardy, and late that night, when all in the house were asleep, she crept downstairs and slipped it under his door. She was afraid that if she did not do the thing at once, her courage would fail. In the note she tried to be quite definite about what she wanted. "I want someone to love me, and I want to love someone," she wrote. "If you are the one for me, I want you to come into the orchard at night and make a noise under my window. It will be easy for me to crawl down over the shed and come to you. I am thinking about it all the time, so if you are to come at all, you must come soon." For a long time Louise did not know what would be the outcome of her bold attempt to secure for herself a lover. In a way she still did not know whether or not she wanted him to come. Sometimes it seemed to her that to be held tightly and kissed was the whole secret of life. And then a new impulse came and she was terribly afraid. The age-old woman's desire to be possessed had taken possession of her, but so vague was her notion of life that it seemed to her that just the touch of John Hardy's hand upon her own hand would satisfy. She wondered if he would understand that. At the table next day, while Albert Hardy talked and the two girls whispered and laughed, she did not look at John but at the table, and as soon as possible escaped. In the evening she went out of the house until she was sure he had taken the wood to her room and gone away. When, after several evenings of intense listening, she heard no call from the darkness in the orchard, she was half beside herself with grief, and decided that for her there was no way to break through the wall that had shut her off from the joy of life. And then, on a Monday evening, 2 or 3 weeks after the writing of the note, John Hardy came for her. Louise had so entirely given up the thought of his coming that for a long time she did not hear the call that came up from the orchard. On the Friday evening before, as she was being driven back to the farm for the week end by one of the hired men, she had on an impulse done a thing that had startled her, and as John Hardy stood in the darkness below and called her name softly and insistently, she walked about in her room and wondered what new impulse had led her to commit so ridiculous an act. The farmhand, a young fellow with black curly hair, had come for her somewhat late on that Friday evening, and they drove home in the darkness. Louise, whose mind was filled with thoughts of John Hardy, tried to make talk, but the country boy was embarrassed and would say nothing. Her mind began to review the loneliness of her childhood, and she remembered with a pang the sharp new loneliness that had just come to her. "I hate everyone," she cried suddenly, and then broke forth into a tirade that frightened her escort. "I hate father and the old man Hardy too," she declared vehemently. "I get my lessons there in the school in town, but I hate that also." Louise frightened the farmhand still more by turning and putting her cheek down upon his shoulder. Vaguely she hoped that he, like that young man who had stood in the darkness with Mary, would put his arms about her and kiss her, but the country boy was only alarmed. He struck the horse with the whip and began to whistle. "The road is rough, eh?" he said loudly. Louise was so angry that reaching up she snatched his hat from his head and threw it into the road. When he jumped out of the buggy and went to get it, she drove off and left him to walk the rest of the way back to the farm. Louise Bentley took John Hardy to be her lover. That was not what she wanted, but it was so the young man had interpreted her approach to him, and so anxious was she to achieve something else that she made no resistance. When, after a few months, they were both afraid that she was about to become a mother, they went one evening to the county seat and were married. For a few months they lived in the Hardy house, and then took a house of their own. All during the first year, Louise tried to make her husband understand the vague and intangible hunger that had led to the writing of the note, and that was still unsatisfied. Again and again she crept into his arms and tried to talk of it, but always without success. Filled with his own notions of love between men and women, he did not listen, but began to kiss her upon the lips. That confused her, so that in the end she did not want to be kissed. She did not know what she wanted. When the alarm that had tricked them into marriage proved to be groundless, she was angry, and said bitter, hurtful things. Later, when her son David was born, she could not nurse him, and did not know whether she wanted him or not. Sometimes she stayed in the room with him all day, walking about and occasionally creeping close to touch him tenderly with her hands, and then other days came when she did not want to see or be near the tiny bit of humanity that had come into the house. When John Hardy reproached her for her cruelty, she laughed. "It is a man-child, and will get what it wants anyway," she said sharply. "Had it been a woman-child, there is nothing in the world I would not have done for it." End of section 9.
Section 10 of Winesburg, Ohio. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Winesburg, Ohio, by Sherwood Anderson. Section 10. Godliness, Part 4. Terror. When David Hardy was a tall boy of 15, he, like his mother, had an adventure that changed the whole current of his life and sent him out of his quiet corner into the world. The shell of the circumstances of his life was broken, and he was compelled to start forth. He left Winesburg, and no one there ever saw him again. After his disappearance, his mother and grandfather both died, and his father became very rich. He spent much money in trying to locate his son, but that is no part of this story. It was in the late fall of an unusual year on the Bentley farms. Everywhere the crops had been heavy. That spring, Jesse had bought part of a long strip of black swampland that lay in the valley of Wine Creek. He got the land at a low price, but had spent a large sum of money to improve it. Great ditches had to be dug and thousands of tile laid. Neighbouring farmers shook their heads over the expense. Some of them laughed and hoped that Jesse would lose heavily by the venture, but the old man went silently on with the work and said nothing. When the land was drained, he planted it to cabbages and onions, and again the neighbours laughed. The crop was, however, enormous and brought high prices. In the 1 year, Jesse made enough money to pay for all the cost of preparing the land, and had a surplus that enabled him to buy 2 more farms. He was exultant and could not conceal his delight. For the first time in all the history of his ownership of the farms, he went among his men with a smiling face. Jesse bought a great many new machines for cutting down the cost of labour, and all of the remaining acres in the strip of black fertile swampland. One day he went into Winesburg and bought a bicycle and a new suit of clothes for David, and he gave his 2 sisters money with which to go to a religious convention at Cleveland, Ohio. In the fall of that year, when the frost came and the trees in the forests along Wine Creek were golden brown, David spent every moment when he did not have to attend school out in the open. Alone or with other boys, he went every afternoon into the woods to gather nuts. The other boys of the countryside, most of them sons of labourers on the Bentley farms, had guns with which they went hunting rabbits and squirrels, but David did not go with them. He made himself a sling with rubber bands and a forked stick, and went off by himself to gather nuts. As he went about, thoughts came to him. He realized that he was almost a man, and wondered what he would do in life. But before they came to anything, the thoughts passed, and he was a boy again. One day he killed a squirrel that sat on one of the lower branches of a tree and chattered at him. Home he ran with the squirrel in his hand. One of the Bentley sisters cooked the little animal, and he ate it with great gusto. The skin he tacked on a board and suspended the board by a string from his bedroom window. That gave his mind a new turn. After that he never went into the woods without carrying the sling in his pocket, and he spent hours shooting at imaginary animals concealed among the brown leaves in the trees. Thoughts of his coming manhood passed, and he was content to be a boy with a boy's impulses. One Saturday morning, when he was about to set off for the woods with the sling in his pocket and a bag for nuts on his shoulder, his grandfather stopped him. In the eyes of the old man was the strained, serious look that always a little frightened David. At such times Jessie Bentley's eyes did not look straight ahead, but wavered and seemed to be looking at nothing. Something like an invisible curtain appeared to have come between the man and all the rest of the world. "I want you to come with me," he said briefly, and his eyes looked over the boy's head into the sky. "We have something important to do today. You may bring the bag for nuts if you wish, it does not matter, and anyway, we'll be going into the woods." Jessie and David set out from the Bentley farmhouse in the old phaeton that was drawn by the white horse. When they'd gone along in silence for a long way, they stopped at the edge of a field where a flock of sheep were grazing. Among the sheep was a lamb that had been born out of season, and this David and his grandfather caught and tied so tightly that it looked like a little white ball. When they drove on again, Jessie let David hold the lamb in his arms. "I saw it yesterday, and it put me in mind of what I have long wanted to do," he said, and again he looked away over the head of the boy with the wavering, uncertain stare in his eyes. After the feeling of exaltation that had come to the farmer as a result of his successful year, another mood had taken possession of him. For a long time he'd been going about feeling very humble and prayerful. Again he walked alone at night, thinking of God, and as he walked he again connected his own figure with the figures of old days. Under the stars he knelt on the wet grass and raised up his voice in prayer. Now he had decided that, like the men whose stories filled the pages of the Bible, he would make a sacrifice to God. "I have been given these abundant crops, and God has also sent me a boy who is called David," he whispered to himself. "Perhaps I should have done this thing long ago." He was sorry the idea had not come into his mind in the days before his daughter Louise had been born, and thought that surely now, when he had erected a pile of burning sticks in some lonely place in the woods, and had offered the body of a lamb as a burnt offering, God would appear to him and give him a message. More and more, as he thought of the matter, he thought also of David, and his passionate self-love was partially forgotten. It is time for the boy to begin thinking of going out into the world, and the message will be one concerning him, he decided. God will make a pathway for him. He will tell me what place David is to take in life, and when he shall set out on his journey. It is right that the boy should be there. If I am fortunate, and an angel of God should appear, David will see the beauty and glory of God made manifest to man. It will make a true man of God of him also. In silence, Jessie and David drove along the road until they came to that place where Jessie had once before appealed to God and had frightened his grandson. The morning had been bright and cheerful, but a cold wind now began to blow, and clouds hid the sun. When David saw the place to which they had come, he began to tremble with fright, and when they stopped by the bridge where the creek came down from among the trees, he wanted to spring out of the phaeton and run away. A dozen plans for escape ran through David's head, but when Jessie stopped the horse and climbed over the fence into the wood, he followed. "It is foolish to be afraid, nothing will happen," he told himself as he went along with the lamb in his arms. There was something in the helplessness of the little animal held so tightly in his arms that gave him courage. He could feel the rapid beating of the beast's heart, and that made his own heart beat less rapidly. As he walked swiftly along behind his grandfather, he untied the string with which the forelegs of the lamb were fastened together. "If anything happens, we will run away together," he thought. In the woods, after they had gone a long way from the road, Jesse stopped in an opening among the trees, where a clearing, overgrown with small bushes, ran up from the creek. He was still silent, but began at once to erect a heap of dry sticks, which he presently set afire. The boy sat on the ground with the lamb in his arms. His imagination began to invest every movement of the old man with significance, and he became every moment more afraid. "I must put the blood of the lamb on the head of the boy," Jesse muttered, when the sticks had begun to blaze greedily, and taking a long knife from his pocket, he turned and walked rapidly across the clearing toward David. Terror seized upon the soul of the boy. He was sick with it. For a moment he sat perfectly still, and then his body stiffened, and he sprang to his feet. His face became as white as the fleece of the lamb that, now finding itself suddenly released, ran down the hill. David ran also. Fear made his feet fly. Over the low bushes and logs he leaped frantically. As he ran, he put his hand into his pocket and took out the branched stick from which the sling for shooting squirrels was suspended. When he came to the creek that was shallow and splashed down over the stones, he dashed into the water and turned to look back, and when he saw his grandfather still running toward him with the long knife held tightly in his hand, he did not hesitate, but reached down, selected a stone, and put it in the sling. With all his strength he drew back the heavy rubber bands, and the stone whistled through the air. It hit Jesse, who had entirely forgotten the boy and was pursuing the lamb, squarely in the head. With a groan he pitched forward and fell almost at the boy's feet. When David saw that he lay still and that he was apparently dead, his fright increased immeasurably. It became an insane panic. With a cry, he turned and ran off through the woods, weeping convulsively. "I don't care. I killed him, but I don't care," he sobbed. As he ran on and on, he decided suddenly that he would never go back again to the Bentley farms or to the town of Winesburg. "I have killed the man of God, and now I will myself be a man and go into the world," he said stoutly, as he stopped running and walked rapidly down a road that followed the windings of Wine Creek as it ran through fields and forests into the west. On the ground by the creek, Jesse Bentley moved uneasily about. He groaned and opened his eyes. For a long time he lay perfectly still and looked at the sky. When at last he got to his feet, his mind was confused, and he was not surprised by the boy's disappearance. By the roadside he sat down on a log and began to talk about God. That is all they ever got out of him. Whenever David's name was mentioned, he looked vaguely at the sky and said that a messenger from God had taken the boy. "It happened because I was too greedy for glory," he declared, and would have no more to say on the matter. End of section 10.